You asked for it, so here it is, the Sorceress in a nutshell. I made sure to use all of my in-game resources to push her as high and fast as possible so I could experience decent and hard content on her, so I could provide the best possible insights of the Sorceress for you. The Sorceress is a female mage that uses elemental energy to kill and slay her enemies on her path. She summons fire puddles, icicles, windy storms and even meteors, whatever your heart desires. Her basic playstyle is simply to just, well, cast and make her foes explode. Let's take a quick look at her identity. While you are casting thunderstorms and meteors, you will be filling up your gauge, which gives you access to two different abilities. First up is a simple and fast executed blink or teleport that allows you to reposition yourself and dodge incoming attacks or simply get out of melee range. Since the Sorceress has long casting times, this can come in very handy. On the other hand, you are able to enter the Mystical Resonance or Magic Discharge and increase your damage and your casting speed, so basically enhancing your combat for a short period of time. Pretty straight up and forward if you ask me. So in order to dig deeper, we gotta talk about the Two Class Engravings. The Sorceress has two class engravings she can choose from. The more commonly used at endgame is the Ignition playstyle. The Ignition playstyle has the following effect. Whenever you use Mystical Resonance, so your combat enhancing gauge, all of your cooldowns are reduced by 50% of what they are at the given moment you use it. And on top of that, you receive up to 25% critical strike chance and 50% critical damage while you use your gauge. What does that mean? Simply put, you are enhancing the effect of your gauge and make it a massive burst window. The playstyle of the Sorceress in the Ignition form revolves around building up your gauge as fast as possible, popping it and then doing massive damage. And we are really talking here about massive damage. It's a very burst oriented playstyle with extremely high numbers. The downside is of course that your damage outside of your burst window is quite small and that missing any of your burst in that window is costing you most of your damage, especially the meteor skill, which we'll talk about later. Now on to the second engraving, which is called Reflux and is pretty much the opposite of the Ignition playstyle. It goes so far that it literally locks you out of using your Mystical Resonance, so the only thing you can do with your gauge is teleporting or blinking. But of course, you get other goodies instead. The Reflux engraving increases damage of all of your skills up to 16% and reduces their cooldowns by 10%. So instead of focusing on the damage burst window, this is a simple spam everything off cooldown playstyle. It is much more forgiving because you can simply use your abilities more often. If you rather want to never stop casting and do damage all the time, this really is more for you. To sum it up real quick, Ignition is a burst-oriented high-number playstyle that has in my opinion a very high skill ceiling and is crazy fun if you hit your abilities as you should, while Reflux is a simple spam everything on cooldown playstyle that is a bit more casual friendly. Later on, more on this. Now let's go over some skills that we use and their tripods. My research is based on high-ranked Korean players and what they use, but I've also noticed a difference in what people are running in their playstyle, which leads me to assume that multiple skills are viable. Please also note that I'm aware right now what the English or EUNA names will be like, so I have to use the Russian names. If you are using this video while playing on the EUNA version, please just simply make sure the icons of the skills and tripods are the same, since names will be different. Please also bear in mind, I'm running the Reflux playstyle, while for some skills, when playing the Ignition playstyle, the tripods will be changed. Let's start with Wall of Fire, which is a low cooldown damage skill, which is mostly used to apply a debuff to the target, increasing the damage taken by the Sorceress and her teammates by 6% for 8 seconds. Try to keep up this debuff at all times. Next up we have Alloy Elements, which is a crystal you summon and shortly after it explodes, and deals damage in a short area around it. Vortex Gust is a frontal cone that deals damage but is ran only for the purpose of countering enemies in high-end content. It is very common to run at least one counter ability because lots of endgame content and guardians can be countered. Moving on to Freezing Rain, that with the tripods I have chosen creates an icy area which hits the foes for multiple times and also causes an explosion at the end, dealing another big hit. Hail of Icicles is a rectangle AoE that summons icicles and simply does damage over its full duration. In my opinion, this is one of the best looking skills that the Sorceress has. Next up is Lightning Bolt, a simple, lightning bolt she summons and does damage in front of it. The ability again changes depending on the tripods you choose. One of our nukes and really cool explosion skills is the Fireball. The Sorceress creates a fireball that travels a short distance and then either explodes on contact or just explodes after reaching a certain distance and deals massive AoE damage. And lastly, the probably most commonly seen and pretty much the whole identity of the Sorceress is the big meteorite. She casts and summons a massive meteor that impacts and does insane damage. She also yells Devasi or Devasi while she does so. We all heard this before, didn't we? We now also have two ultimates. Our first one, which forms some form of big AoE circle or dome and deals damage, while the other one simply summons a huge amount of, again, meteors falling from the sky. Please again keep in mind, more skills than the ones I presented are viable. Different tripods are viable too, and I personally have not done enough math to know what is the best choice, but the ones I presented is what I'm running based on some high-end Korean reflux players. For Ignition, tripods definitely change a lot. Now that we know what skills we run, we can have a look at the basic playstyle, and again, this depends on what engraving you choose to run. For the playstyle I chose, the reflux one, it's actually quite simple. Make sure to keep your debuff from Wall of Fire up, and otherwise, honestly, just smash your buttons. Make sure to land all of your abilities as much as possible because, well, it's just very spammy. I think Reflux is pretty straightforward. There's not much to explain besides, well, keep your uptime. Time to give you guys my opinion. Like I mentioned earlier, I invested a lot of my resources to get my Sorceress to high gear score. I've run the Legion raids Volten and Biakiz on her to really get a feeling for this class before making this video. I even went out of my way to build her for Ignition once and then rebuild for Reflux. Trust me, that did cost me a lot of resources, but I wanted to really provide an insight into both of her playstyle. So first, let's talk about Ignition. Even after investing so many resources, Ignition felt kinda lackluster to me. It took me quite long to always fill up my bar and my identity gauge to then go into my burst window. This is what I personally did not enjoy with the Ignition playstyle. It reminded me a little bit of Soulfist PTSD when just running around and, well, doing no real damage until my burst window came back up. The other issue I had was that missing my main gauge generators obviously made me sleep for a bit longer. You can though argue that that's just player skill, of course. Then obviously the burst window of the Ignition playstyle feels really damn good. I was genuinely surprised at how high the numbers were. I did multiple millions of damage within just 15 seconds. Yet obviously again, if you miss during your burst window, you will end up disappointed. So to TLDR it, I think the Ignition playstyle is a very high-end playstyle that requires extremely good knowledge of the raids you're attempting and requires a massive amount of investment in stats and also tripods and many other things. If you do enjoy a burst-oriented playstyle, this is absolutely the way to go. It's extremely satisfying if you manage to hit everything and see those high numbers. Now for Reflux, the playstyle I chose in the end, things are much simpler. It gives me more of a traditional caster vibe by simply letting me spam my abilities. The Sorceress becomes a very fast-paced and spammy class which keeps you on your toes. Messing up a skill feels not as bad as it does on Ignition. It's a more casual-oriented playstyle from what I feel like, and it also allows me to actually use my teleport that is gauge-bound, unlike doing Ignition where you want to keep your gauge for your burst window. So if instead of a burst-oriented playstyle you prefer a more spammy playstyle, Reflux is definitely your choice. Also, when making the Sorceress simply an alt character, I suggest the Reflux playstyle since it's just, well, less hard to master, but obviously this depends on you. In general though, the Sorceress feels very fun to play. She is damn squishy though, so be prepared to have the grey screen part of your Sorceress life. Since she relies on casting a lot, you need to really know what's about to happen before starting your casts. I'd say in general it's a high skill setting class, making it much simpler with the Reflux playstyle. Lastly, we'll cover some engravings and stats for Tier 1 and Tier 3. This section is again very dependent on the playstyle you chose, because it will change the engravings you are running. Again, I'll be focusing on the Reflux playstyle here. Bear in mind, if you want more information on the Ignition playstyle, I highly suggest to watch Saint Tony's video on Sorceress. He's a high-end Korean player that main sources with the Ignition playstyle. I'll be linking his video below. For Reflux in Tier 1, you want to run critical with agility. Depending on what you prefer, you can either max agility or crit, but bear in mind this should then also change your engravings. If you decided to max agility, I would run Grudge and Precision Dagger for Reflux. If you decide to max out critical hit, I would then run Grudge, Adrenaline, and also again Reflux obviously. For Tier 3, you want to max out agility with crit and go for Grudge, Adrenaline, Massacre, Precision Dagger, and Reflux. Before ending the video, please again bear in mind to take all of this with a grain of salt, as I also expect more people to do math and maybe come up with better builds or combinations that might deal slightly more damage than what I suggested. I simply know these engravings together are very strong and are a solid foundation. But now we're at the end of this video. Again, I can only highly suggest and recommend to also watch Saint Tony's video if you are interested in playing the Sorceress. My video simply is a short introduction to the Sorceress, while his is much more in-depth, so make sure to check it out. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching the video, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I also want to generally say thank you to all of you for subscribing to my channel and watching my videos. 2021 has been an amazing year for me and for my YouTube channel that I could not have done without any of you. If you want to support me further, you can always just suggest my videos to your friends, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and go follow me on Twitch or on Twitter. Otherwise, you can also subscribe to my Twitch channel. Any help is massively appreciated because it helps me to continue doing what I love most, which is content creation and preparing you for the official Lost Ark release, which is very soon. Thank you so much for watching, wishing you all a happy new year.